because we doing better, we have to give them back money. So had we not done that, we would actually had a positive number for December. But again, it's kind of like, the way our arrangements work with our airfield and our terminal, we have to give them money. And we're strategic in how we've done that. We're strategic. Years ago, we would hit them two ways. We hit them on the front end and on the back end. We hit you high on the rates, and then we'll ask for more money on the back end. Really great relationship. Darren will tell you in a minute. Really great relationship when you say, hey, you hit me hard on the front end, and then you ask for money on the back end. Really love you guys. So now we do it on the front end, and hopefully we're in a position to give some money back on the back end. So it's one-time payment as opposed to twice. I'm sure you appreciate that, right, Darren? Thanks. Then breaking down where the money comes from. See number 2 there, obviously, during COVID, that was by far number 1. But we're kind of back to where we were pre-COVID, and you can see it's slowly moving down. And we've talked about how we're using that care strategically as a bridge so that, once it's no longer there, we're in a position to keep moving forward. See, we're all the numbers there, but kind of those variances going down there. Then here, the biggest variances in our budgets, we talked about salary and wages and some of the head counts and employee counts there. But again, we've used a lot of the accounts are there. We're up significantly from where we were last year, both expenses and employee personnel costs. But the number of employee counts are not as high. But again, we're paying for it in other ways with overtime and some of those other things. Again, that's kind of what we talked about on the CARES and ARPA as we strategically moving forward. Again, we have to use it all by the end of next year. So we can't keep kicking that can, although we would love to keep kicking it if we're not using it. Got to use it all by next year, so next year is definitely going to be used. Kind of breaking it down, kind of what I said there, we're minus 12 on personnel costs versus budget, which our budget was pretty robust. But you can see we're up 9 versus 2022. Same thing on non-personnel expenses, minus 13 versus our budget. But again, 7 versus the year before. And again, a lot of that was attributable, and you'll see it when I talk about it in a minute, to the weather. Last year we didn't have, we had a pretty mild winter. This year so far, Steve's smiling over there, excited. We kind of got hit early so far with the weather. I'll talk about that in a minute. Here's our counts again, where we were, 232 FTEs is kind of that equivalent of 40 hours on a regular basis. If you look at our numbers, and if you go back, again, prior to WBF, or at the end of WBF, we're up significantly as far as employee counts from where we were at that point. We're up a lot. So again, we're continuing to grow. It's a good thing. Obviously, we had some more expansion in there with the budget, but we're coming up with a number that comes more like what we can afford, which is more in the 220. But again, we have some room for some additional growth there. Kind of breaking it down by the departments, you can kind of see what they look like there. Some of the big variances there that we've seen recently. And again, some of these do change with the weather. You see that, when it gets cold, Connie and Steve and Darren will tell you certain departments, when it gets cold, people don't work there anymore. It was nice when it was warm out, but now it's cold. Then breaking down our cash from when we had the last time we spoke, some of the yellow is kind of what's changed from the last time. And most of the time, the biggest changes are usually in the timing of some of these capital items. You see that item number 21 there? That is actually the CARES from December. Even though it's going to be recorded as part of December, we did not get the money until January. They got some additional requirements now for people that weren't doing it right. So it's a little slower as far as getting some of our CARES money, but we anticipate getting that either by the end of this month or early next month. Breaking it down, again, we're doing quite well. Over 200 for the next 6 months. I think we're well over 150 for the next 12 when you look at this one. Even though you're at 60, I get nervous when we get it below 150 because you need time to react to these things. But we've said as a board, we never want to go down to that 3 days cash on hand. Thank you, I really appreciate that. And then I went to, and this slide is just for Mike. I want him to appreciate it. The old number used to be about 300,000. And this is kind of what some of the, additional costs with some of our contractors and materials and supplies, how much more things are. So our full-year budget is almost 510,000 and that we have budgeted for snow. Everything is kind of recorded to snow with the exception, and I added that number in there, of those incremental benefits, because those get kind of lost. We code things to snow, we code things for material and supplies, and we code things to equipment and all that. So that's coded to snow. But the incremental benefits are the percentages of salaries that are attributable to benefits, payroll tax, pension, workman's comp, unemployment. Those are all life insurance. Whenever you get more money, those are charged. And I don't show it, but eventually, when we do our workman's comp, they're going to say, you have more money, here's your payroll, you got to pay us that money. So that's in there as well. So you can kind of see where we got in. And this is actually for the first 21 days, which was, I think, through Sunday. And you can see that the last 2 years, we didn't have any storms for the first 21 days. The last 2 years, no storms on the first 21 days. But this year, obviously, we were almost went through half of our budget through 21 days of January. So hopefully, it'll stay like it is today for the rest of the winter, and we'll be okay. Any questions?
So a move to accept the financial presentation for the board. Thank you.
Second.
Larry. Second, Mike. All in favor of that? Aye. All right. I have one question. How do you promote the bus going through security when it gets there?
What do you mean?
Well, like, do we promote that as an advantage?
We've done some. We haven't done a ton of it. We did do some in the beginning, but just on some of our digital advertising and social media stuff, we've done some.
All right, cool. The Fulton Bank Bridge loan, Todd.
All right. For some of you who might have paid off your mortgage, I figured this would be a slightly good note. We had our bridge loan. It was a 2-year loan. We did get the notification that it's been paid off. So we all get to pat ourselves on the back. Unfortunately, we still have the big loan to pay, but at least we get a little pat on the back that says we did complete our payments for the bridge loan. Hopefully, we'll get our RACP money at some point to pay for the stuff that we used it for. All right, any
Are we
questions?
going to have a pool for that, for reaching in the back?
I already talked to Ryan about that. He can tell you what's going on. We get great grants on those RACP. Unfortunately, we don't get the money.
I think we could do a block pool for that one, put the month down and the year down at the each axis and go from there.
There you go. There you go.
We may have to start in 2027.
Well, thanks. All right. Any questions?
Well, thank
All
you
right.
for that.
Thank you.
Are we gonna cover, are we gonna talk about the $40 million grant in another committee?
We can. We have some capital update when we can talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
When we get into the business committee.
All right then,
Move to adjourn.
move to adjourn, thank you. We're adjourned.
All right, we'll call to order the business committee meeting. Would you call the roll, please?
Justin Grimshaw,
Here.
Ann Bone, Dawn Bradshaw. Here. James Irwin.
Here.
Jeff Matskin. Glenn Reedman.
Present.
Chris Worley. We have a quorum.
Do we have any public comment?
No, sir.
No public comment. I will take a motion for approval of the meeting minutes for November 23rd, 2023.
Second.
Moved by Dawn and second by Jim. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None. We will move on to discussion item, air service update.
Thank you. I'm going to actually hand it right over to Brendan Fiore, who's our air service consultant, and you're on fruits and slides, and he and I can both answer questions if there are any. So.
Morning.
All right.
All right, so this is going to be a relatively short presentation because I wanted to leave some extra time for Q&A because I know that we always have some, and I felt like it would be maybe a better use of time than showing you a bunch more charts and graphs. So let's see what we go.
You have to hit the power button
Oh,
first
Howard.
and then.
Oh, okay.
So you,
All right.
Or him. That was him.
All right,
Yeah.
I don't know which one I hit. We'll figure it out. There's only 3 of them, and I can't even figure that out. Okay. So this is sort of piggybacking off of what you already heard in terms of the demand growth that we've seen at the airport. This is since 2014, and the blue chart indicates this number is passengers daily each way. So that's how many passengers are getting on planes here in downtown and heading off to wherever they're going. So in 2014, we're at 760 on average in a day, right up to the pandemic. Obviously, it reached record levels of 1,100 or so, and now we are very, very close, and probably by the end of the year, have pretty much matched that in terms of the daily traffic. This isn't the same as maybe the numbers that you guys have, because this won't include any bus traffic. It also doesn't include non-revenue passengers. So airline employees and such won't be included in this. So it'll be a little bit different than your numbers, but these are revenue passengers. You can see that the airfares have been rising, but still at $153 one way is actually quite a healthy fare in terms of being low for the consumer. It does have an impact on airlines because they obviously want to maximize revenue, but this is really indicative of Allegiant's presence in the market because they are a low-fare airline, so your fares just in general are going to be low on average. Want to show you a little bit about how this divergence has gone in terms of the ratio of low-fare service versus network or legacy carrier service. You can see back in 2014, if we take that as a baseline, 100%, you can see that Allegiant has grown 309% in that period of time, and your network or legacy carrier service is only at 69% of what it was. So trending down over time, although we've sort of flattened out here a little bit. Really, it was COVID that really hit the network carriers hard, especially at small airports. A lot of this is related to the economic profile of regional jets. Got worse and worse and worse, and then it got really bad. And so airlines, especially Delta in particular, but United also, and to a much lesser degree American, have been removing those small airplanes from their fleets because they're just not economical anymore, and there's not enough pilots to fly all these airplanes. So if they're going to have 2 pilots, they're going to put them on big airplanes, not small airplanes. And so what you're seeing there is not unique to ABE. In a lot of mid-sized, smaller airports that are particularly near big hub airports, we are seeing the network carriers basically decide that the interstate network is the feed to their hubs if it's a close airport. And, this has always been an issue for ABE because of the proximity to Philadelphia and Newark. That issue has not gone away. If anything, it's even more of a challenge today. But it's an industry-wide issue. It's nothing unique here. In fact, you guys, the bus service actually is sort of helps you maintain that connectivity to those hubs, where in a lot of similar situations, when they don't have a bus option, they completely lose it. So they have no, other than their own vehicles, no way to get to these other hubs. So if you want to look at and think about how we've done in comparison to the other what we call peer airports. Some of them are local airports. Some of them are airports that have a very similar dynamic. In Flint, for example, that's a client of mine. And unfortunately, they've struggled a lot. They're an Allegiant base. Allegiant has been their saving grace as well. But they've done worse in retaining their network service than ABE has. And so they're an hour away from Detroit Airport. And so people get in the car and go there as well. So they're at 65% of where they were in 2014. You can see sort of your more closely related peer airports. AVP up there, that they're only at 91% of where they were. Harrisburg hasn't recovered. Atlantic City hasn't completely recovered, and here we are at 132%. So if you really want to think about who's winning in the region in terms of the regional airports, ABE has really been a winner. It's not all, rainbows and butterflies. That story is, it's going to be different in the future because of the makeup of the type of service. But overall, in the new structure of the airline industry in the US, AB is definitely a winner, and particularly when you look back a decade or so ago and where we were versus now. Really, it's been a remarkable recovery, and kind of all of this great stuff that's going on here, it's all tied together. That improvement helps to build all this, right? And then building all this helps to cement that growth. It provides the capacity, the passenger experience that allows Allegiant in particular to continue growing here. As a result of all this, though, we've seen a very significant shift in the balance of market share. Whereas a decade ago, only 26% of the seats here were operated by low-cost carriers. Now it's 62%. So it's definitely a shift. You can kind of think of it as a niche, basically. The industry used to be full of airlines that were all basically the same. Even the low-cost carriers were basically the same. For those of you who remember AirTran was a discounted version of a network carrier. Hub and spoke, very similar overall concept, just lower costs. Lower costs were primarily achieved through labor. But that isn't an avenue for airlines anymore. Labor costs go up for everybody, especially pilot costs. Pilot costs converge, they're all union. So you can't have a lot lower labor costs for pilots at an airline than anyone else does. Everybody ends up about the same level. And so what's happened is the airlines have stratified themselves through product offering for the most part. So you have airlines that really focus on a premium product like Delta, investing in clubs, investing in TVs on your airplane, and all these premium products, and they can charge more. And then you have airlines like Allegiant that say, we don't want to do any of that. We want to provide value. You have to pay for everything extra maybe, but we want to give you nonstop service to actually where you want to go. And so in the old days, every airline did everything. Now what we're seeing is that airlines are specializing in certain niches. And airports like ABE, which are really close to big network carrier hubs, have trouble being in the network carrier niche because of that. So, but it's actually because your proximity to those population centers, it makes you a better candidate to be a low-cost airport. And really, that's what we've seen over time. Whether it was intentional or not, over time, we've seen the shift of this becoming more and more of a low-cost carrier market, low-cost carrier airport than a network carrier airport. That's not good. This isn't like a permanent downward thing where it gets to zero, but it is going to be a thing where it settles probably for the foreseeable future, somewhere closer to where it is today. Probably, I would say there's probably going to be more low-cost carrier market share gained probably in the next 5 years. Maybe it's 75-25 at some point. It's probably inevitable at this point. I don't think there's a whole lot that we can do because we're just kind of fighting. We'd be fighting, we're trying to swim upstream here, but the reality is that this isn't a bad thing at all. This is actually really good for the airport. Finding a niche that works is better than trying to be something for everybody, but not being anything that's everything for everybody. I'm trying to figure out the logic of that. Well, because I mean, it's not a big enough market to have a portfolio of service that's really robust. I mean, it's a nice size market, but it isn't in the airline industry world, it's not that big of a market. And so there's not enough demand to be everything to everybody. So in this case, specializing in the low-cost niche is actually a really, really beneficial thing for the airport because you really, as we showed on that last slide, you've separated yourself. AVP doesn't have that. Atlantic City doesn't really, even though they're all low-cost carrier, they don't have nearly the population catchment. They don't have the business, component of their model to be able to do a lot of this stuff. Income, the income of the people in the region, for example. So here we are. If you would have asked us a few years ago, back in 2014, what the route map would look like, I wouldn't have said this. Wouldn't have said Denver for sure, which is really indicative of where the future is, right? So we've done Florida, We've done a lot of Florida. Florida has been a huge success. For those of you who don't know, I think last time I was here, I may have mentioned the ABE to Orlando Sanford market is Allegiant's #1 revenue market in their entire system. It is their best market that they fly, period. In summer, they're up to some days 13 flights a week. I think they've even done 14 flights a week, which is the only market they've ever done anything near that much frequency on. It's a very, very, very strong market for Allegiant. And that's why every time they add a new Florida market, they tend to think, okay, is it going to work from ABE? Now, we don't have all of them. Some of them they've tried before, maybe haven't done so great. Some of them don't make maybe as much sense. Like Destin, which is in the Panhandle right about here. Problem with Destin is a summer market primarily. So you've got to have people who want to go to Florida in the summer. And you know, that works for people who live maybe in Ohio where they can't drive to a beach. But you know, maybe not so much for people in this region. So what we've seen beyond Florida, though, was the expansion to places like Nashville. Nashville turned out to be a big hit for them. So they learned a lot from Nashville, and then they said, okay, well, let's try Denver. And Denver seems to be off to a really, really strong start, which is not surprising, but it is very encouraging because every time we do something that isn't Florida, Allegiant's like, okay, that worked. What's the next thing we can do, right? Nashville helped lead to Denver. And so what's the next thing? Well, we don't know what the next thing is. A lot of it's going to depend on where Allegiant decides if there's new markets that Allegiant tries to fly to. The biggest challenge we have in growing this portfolio further is that Allegiant has specific operational restrictions that make it very difficult for them to fly. Well, basically, they have a crew time limit. The crews have to be able to fly, 8 hours or 8 hours out back in a day. And if it's 8 hours and 5 minutes, they can't do it. So you can't, the same crew cannot fly to Las Vegas and back. It's too far. They can fly Denver and back, but they can't fly to Las Vegas and back. And so that makes Las Vegas a lot more technically challenging for them. It's possible to do, but it's going to require overnighting crews somewhere. Of course, they have crews based in both markets, but it's just more challenging for them. So that's one of the things that we'll be working on is trying to expand that portfolio further west. But overall, just a really strong route network has been developing. So to give you some insight of kind of where we think things are going to go in the near future, Allegiant is going to be at an all-time record of 32 weekly flights in March. That's 9 destinations, but there'll be, I think it's actually 12 destinations or something like that when we look at the thing in totality. American will be adding the 4th flight to Charlotte in June, so that's a big deal. You know, when they added the bus to Philadelphia, you know, I think maybe in the back of our minds a little bit might be, well, are they gonna, you know, are we gonna ever see expanded service to Charlotte by plane, right, or anywhere else? So to see them add the 4th one to Charlotte is an indication that the first 3 are doing really well. Primarily, so that's good news. Delta is adding back the mainline aircraft, the Boeing 717. I think it's the overnight flight. So that's good. We had that before the pandemic came out. Now it's back. We expect they're going to convert one of the other flights to a 717, hopefully this summer. They've indicated that they probably will, but have not given us a guarantee on that yet. So I expect at this point that Atlanta will probably be all mainline before Detroit comes back. Now the reason Detroit has still not returned, and we've talked with them plenty about it, it's primarily more of a Detroit issue. They have not focused resources on growing back Detroit. They've been focusing their resources on their coastal hubs. So particularly Los Angeles, Seattle, Boston, New York, out of the pandemic, they had like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to become market share leader at those airports. And they chose to do that because they built new terminal LaGuardia. If anyone's been, it's really nice. New terminal LAX, invested a lot in all these airports. And so they've been focusing on trying to build their capacity in those coastal airports to the neglect of their, what they call the core airports, their core hubs, which are Atlanta, Detroit, Minneapolis, and Salt Lake City. Now, Detroit, of all of them, has been the slowest to return. That's partly There's a lot of reasons for that. It's not necessarily related specifically to Detroit, but they basically have a monopoly in Detroit. And so it can wait. You know, they're focusing their capacity in competitive markets primarily. Detroit can wait. The other thing is Detroit was dominated by regional jets. They had a lot of markets with 50-seat regional jets, including ABE. They've completely eliminated the 50-seat regional jets from their fleets. There are no more. So everything has to go on bigger airplanes. But that makes the bar a little bit higher. So instead of having 50 seats per minimum of flight, we're gonna have 76 seats. So basically, we had 3 flights on 50-seaters. That's about the same capacity as 2 flights on 76-seaters. But because of the pilot shortage, they have 76-seaters that are sitting, not being flown right now because they don't have enough pilots to fly them. So at some point, when they've grown enough on the big airplane side and the small airplanes start trickling down from places they're flying today to even smaller markets like ABE to Detroit, the airplane will become available, and if they can crew it, then the possibility starts to return that they could do it. But I'll be honest, like if it was a barn burner, fantastic route for them, and they have been doing great for years, it would have been back already. It was never a great route. They've indicated to us it was good enough to come back. It should come back at some point, but they keep kicking the can down the road when we talk to them about it. And you know, it's fair because there's a lot of places that they're not flying yet that are clearly, you know, would be stronger markets for them, but they can't fly. It's mostly an operational challenge, but there's a pecking order within that when they start to return service, and ABE Detroit isn't going to be at the top. They would rather put that capacity into Atlanta because they do really well in the Atlanta ABE market. And then United is remaining steady at their 2 daily flights to Chicago. There's not really a whole lot of movement on that. We're happy that they're still here and they seem content with that. And we're hoping to get that up to 3 at some point. And then obviously that complements with the bus, and hopefully at some point they get the bus post-security and all that. But overall, I mean, first half of 2024 is forecasting to be 12% higher in total seats versus 23. So the future looks bright in terms of passenger revenue for sure. So that's the deck. Happy to take questions.
I have more of a complaint built within a question.
Awesome. I hope it's about me.
So in one of your first slides, you showed like the pricing for Allegiant at 153.
Well, that's the average in the whole market.
Yeah, an
Yeah.
average. So what I'm seeing is that this deceptive process going forward, like we will let you think that the price is this, but now you're paying for luggage and carry-on, and if you want to pick your seat and actually sit with your family. And it just seems like are people flying naked that now you're charging us to bring luggage with us? Do you ever think we might get back to this is the price?
Only if it's regulated by the government.
Oh, yay.
But here's the reason that you don't want them to do that. It actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it. A lot of those things you don't use every time, right? When it's
Luggage?
No. Well, I mean, if you're taking 2 bags and a carry-on, and I'm just taking a carry-on, and we're paying the same fare, I'm subsidizing your 2 bags.
But to assume that people are going to carry at least a carry-on, like to charge for a carry-on, just seems like you're nickel and diming people to death, and not you personally, but
I can take it.
Yeah, it just seems like we've gotten to the point where they're charging for everything instead of making a base price that says, we assume that you're going to want to have clothes when you get to your destination.
So do you remember when I was saying that, like, you know, it used to be airlines all had the same product. They also all had the same price, basically. You know, I mean, if you're flying to Atlanta on AirTran from here, Delta's going to have the same. Well, they didn't fly to Atlanta, did they, from here? Yeah, kind of somewhere. Delta's going to have the same price, right? There was no real competition. Everybody basically ended up having the same price in the same market. But what that did was it was bad for profitability because the carriers that had higher costs ended up not being able to charge higher fares, and so they lost money. But those higher costs often went into things like, you know, better service, lounges, all these amenities that you get, TVs on your plane, all that kind of stuff. And so when you unbundle it, what you're doing is, and this is what the industry is, this is how the industry would say, you're giving people the opportunity to pay less. If you want all of those things still, if you want the 2 free check bags and all that, you get to choose whether you're paying for it or not. And now when you add it all up, is it gonna be as high as whatever, Delta would have charged you if you're on AirTran, or let's say Allegiant? Yeah, it's gonna be. But that's your individual choice. And you may say, you know what, maybe I just consolidate to 1 bag this time, or something like that, because what you're doing is you're giving yourself the opportunity to pay less. If you're flying on, one of the traditional, carrier that had more of a flat fare, you're just gonna pay that fare no matter what. So if you kind of turn it around a little bit, think about that low fare. The only reason that low fare exists on Allegiant is because they can charge other people who want those services for the other things. If it was a flat fare, the whole thing's going up. So you at least have the opportunity to buy lower. And the DOT has been on them a lot to make sure that they're very transparent about, okay, every step of the way, this is gonna cost you more and more. Because at the beginning, they weren't. Beginning, you find out at the end of the process how much you owed. Now, along the way, it usually adds up, and you can go back and say, I don't want this or want that. But absent regulatory change, that's not gonna change, because it helps the low-cost carriers continue to offer the low fares to the people who really want the low fares. But it also helps the legacy carriers, network carriers, differentiate themselves by offering a more premium product. Because otherwise, they're just competing at one. If everybody's competing at the same price, there's no difference in the product. Like it's one size fits all. And that was, when the airlines did that, they lost billions and billions of dollars. So unfortunately, I don't think it's going to change.
Any other questions?
Right, this is all good stuff. This is real positive things. I just had a quick observation. In Todd's presentation, he said the load factor was 80-some%, 87%, I think it was. And you're selling tickets for under $1.50 each way. How do you grow that? Where do you find more revenue to come in? Because you have a very small margin on the top where
You get more bags. Exactly. So the other thing to keep in mind, and this is something the government is, at some point is going to have to reckon with it. So you are taxed on your base fare. You are not taxed on all those ancillary fees. So what's happening is that if you included all, the taxes are higher. If you separate them out, the taxes are lower. So what they do is they try to get more of that move to the ancillary fee, so the airline can keep more of that money themselves and not have to give it to the government. So when they charge the bag fees, for example, they have to keep it all. Yeah. So the fares, they have to give the government 10%. And so it makes sense for the airlines to want to have more of that stuff in the fees, because then that margin that they're getting is increasing. But I mean, margins are going to shrink for a lot of these carriers because their costs are increasing, and the fares aren't going to be able to keep up forever with the speed at which fares are increasing. The fares are increasing for lots of just structural reasons, shortages of labor and all the key components. I mean, you've all seen what's going on with Boeing, and Airbus isn't a whole lot better. They can't deliver airplanes. Airplanes are being pulled out of service. Expenses are just skyrocketing for the industry. Fuel is up and down. Right now it's okay. But a lot of these factors are just permanently moving north, and that's just going to require higher and higher fares, which, to be honest with you, puts AB in a pretty good position, because you have your ultra low cost carrier is literally the best one in the country. Like, it is the most financially stable. It is long-term, always been financially stable through its entire history. Its model is so different, and you see what's going on with Spirit. Spirit very well could be in bankruptcy protection within the next year or less, maybe at this point. JetBlue is rudderless. They don't know what their plan is. Frontier is privately held, but suffering from a lot of the same issues Spirit is. We've got 2 startup ULCCs in Avello and Breeze that haven't made a dime yet. And they're just burning through cash, trying to find, some place to go. And you're sitting here with these guys who are still one of the most profitable airlines on earth on a margin basis, who are growing slower than they had been because they had pilot issues and then they have Boeing delivery issues as well. But by growing slower right now, that's helped them maintain a level of stability in their finances that some of the other low-cost carriers haven't been able to do because they grew too fast. Spirit and Frontier, Spirit a few years ago was the most profitable airline on earth on a margin basis. And now they're flirting with bankruptcy protection. And that's because they grew so fast, they outgrew their market. Darren and I were talking about this at breakfast, they have planes that have 220 seats on them. And there's just not that many markets, point-to-point markets, where there's no hub involved, that can just fill 220 seats multiple times a day. It's a lot of seats. And you probably are all familiar with the public's and your own probably perception of what Frontier and Spirit are. They're nobody's favorite airline. So they're not going to be the airline that you jump to. So it's sort of I don't want to say the airline's a last resort. That's not a fair way to say it. But filling 220 seats, their market demographics are different than Allegiant. Their market demographics tend to be people that have a lot less income than Allegiant's. So when things go bad, with your job or whatever, you're just not going to fly. And so that's part of the problem that Spirit's seeing in particular, is they added a whole bunch more seats, but their customer base doesn't have the disposable income to continue flying more and more and more. They go to Florida once, they're done. Maybe they'll go back next year, maybe they'll go back the year after. Allegiant customers, as you guys probably know, some of you probably do this yourselves. You're going down, 3-4 times a year to your second home or whatever, in Punta Gorda. And so that's how the model is different. And that's why you're in a good position to have Allegiant.
Are the ancillary fees included in the average fares you show us?
No.
They're not?
No.
So it's in addition to that? Okay.
Yeah, and all airlines are different with those. So the industry, the DOT, which requires the reporting of that, has never fully integrated those in. Some of them, I'm not even sure all of them get reported, to be honest with you.
I think during our finance committee, John Hayes was on the phone. He had a question about AVP and Breeze and the service starting up there with MCO and how that might or might not affect what's happening here.
Don't think it's going to affect what's happened here. I mean, they might draw a little bit of traffic, but like I said, one of the impacts it's going to have is probably a big part of the reason that now Allegiant's going to fly to MCO from here. They're fierce competitors, and if they think that somebody is going to try to come in and take their market, they're going to defend it. And so, on a net basis, it probably has helped so far. Their success is going to be related to their ability to fill those seats organically. They're not going to be hauling people from here up to there. They're going to have to retain the folks that they are going, that come down here. And hopefully, look, I would love for all these carriers to succeed. There's opportunities for APE for some of them if they succeed. But they're starting off at a very small level there, and they've got a lot stacked against them. So we'll see. I don't think it'll be it's not going to, you're not going to notice much of a difference at all here. Now, if for some reason it's great and they end up building out a big portfolio there, and they survive this startup period as an airline, then, it might have some impact. But again, their geography isn't as good. They can't tap into the same catchment region that you can. So ultimately, I don't think it's a big threat. It's a nice for them to have, but relative to what you've got going on here, I don't think it's going to be a big impact.
Okay, thanks for that, Brad. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Any other questions for Brad?
Just an observation, and I know this has a lot of variables with it, but can you give me a rough idea what the break even is nowadays? Is it 50% load factor or 80%?
No, I can't. It does have, that's the problem. It has too many variables. Every airline's different. Every route's different. How many bags they sold is different. Yeah. So I would say, if you're at 86%, you could probably assume, and, you know, we know they're doing well here, it's somewhere in the 80s. It's a lot higher than it used to be. If you're, you know, network carriers, it will be a little bit lower. But, you know, if you're comfortably in the mid-80s, you're probably okay because that's really high historically, but also the airline is, when you're that high, the airline is able to manage inventory better because it means there's a lot of demand, so they can play with pricing to, you know, they can keep raising prices until they reach that inflection point. But if they're that high, it means they're probably already doing that. They're probably already, well, they are definitely managing the pricing on it to get to that point. So mid-80s is a really good place to be for any kind of service, but it literally, and it changes from month to month on each route. So there's really no way to say.
Back in the day, if you got a 50% load factor, you needed a wheelbarrow to take the money.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, and that was back when the fares were all like, if they weren't all the same, even if you go back to kind of the regulated days for sure, then it was, you know, definitely, you know, they actually set fare levels to make sure that they meet the break-even load factor. It was like reverse engineered. But nowadays, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I rarely pay attention to load factor when I'm evaluating anything. It's average fares are a better indicator. And even then, they don't include the ancillary. So what we typically do is just ask the airline how they're doing. It's usually the most effective way to find out. If they smile and you're doing well, you take a deep breath, you know, it's like, oh boy, here we go. That's fair, right, Darren?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's half the conversation every time we meet with them, is just what's going on. How the things going that we're doing today, you know, before we talk about what's next.
And it changes fast. Month to month, you know, different environment. It doesn't take, the size of airplanes you have, especially on the network carrier side, it doesn't take a whole lot of additional demand to move the needle on a regional jet.
Any other questions for Brad? All right. Thank you, Brad.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Brad.
We'll move on to Ryan and capital project update.
Thank you.
Clicker's here.
Oh, yes.
Let's run through a typical slides. It's been kind of a quiet last couple of months in terms of construction, kind of getting ready for some other projects coming up this year, which I'll get into. Obviously in winter shutdown with the runway, but still have that up there. Project closeout was submitted with the FAA back in December, still waiting on that final reimbursement, which is why it's on there. Once we get it, we'll take it off the list. Package 4, really just punch list items in the spring, some of the final closeout paperwork now, and then hopefully in the next couple of months that'll come off the list as well. Package 5, again, winter shutdown. Probably the next couple of months they might do some of the runway edge lighting replacement, but right now the biggest thing is just having discussions with the carriers about timing of construction impacts this coming year, which we're doing now, kind of in the construction downtime. Boarding bridge, again, we've talked about, really the submittals have been approved. Bridge is in fabrication. Again, in the spring, we're looking to start that work, probably beginning of March, some of the foundation components, which will then follow with the bridge itself. We're looking in terms of phasing Bridge 3 first. So we have that bridge, because Bridge 10 is a bridge we use now. Once it's in operation, then we'll switch to put Bridge 10 in. Parking garage, in terms of the programming and design we've talked about, probably in the next week, we should be sending letters out to try and get some of the interviews for February. So more further discussions on that, but we're still moving that process forward. Some of the building demolition, this will probably be the last time we talk with this slide, but some of the smaller items that we mentioned before, the air handler unit, in that left picture there you can kind of see on the ramp they took down. And then the two other properties, one of them was actually inside the fence. Another one was out on Weaversville. Those have since been demolished. The Dolphin property, there's still a garage and I think a little shed that they got to take down. But by the end of January, that should be done. And then, as I'll get into in a minute with some of the other projects, then the government building discussion will kind of take place of these. As a reminder, these were covered under some of the CARES funding as well. Moving to Queen City, again, this runway construction's been complete as of last year, so working through the closeout as well, reviewing the documents to submit to the FAA in the next couple weeks to get, I think there's about 700,000 sitting out there, so again, that's why we track it until the project's done. Again, where we are in our projects, updated a lot of these from November, our last meeting, but you can kind of see where we're tracking in terms of some of the costs, the reimbursements. We'll get to some of that with the connector later as well. But then the one thing I wanted to touch on a little bit was really what's next now that we got the budget approved. This is kind of a snippet of our Exhibit A from the budget. So you got our grant projects on top, the major non-grants on the bottom. But if you're kind of looking at it, basically the green is probably the next couple months that you'll start seeing us talk about more in terms of looking through the design, getting some other things moving. Frank, to your question earlier about the cargo, the North Side Logistics and Cargo Complex, that's at number 3. Our portion of that is the airfield side, so working on the taxiway, obviously coordinating, as you know, with AFCO, the developer, from the building, the roadway, the apron. So more to come on some of those discussions. I think, you know, Tom and the group, we were all talking. I mean, it's the first time we've ever gotten an infra grant, so there's a lot of requirements. Once we get the paperwork, we'll know where that goes, but definitely a huge team effort.
Officially got the letter from the DOT this morning, so yeah.
So that'll be a good one. But just to kind of give, again, the committee, and you'll see they're grayed out, but just kind of looking year ahead, some, you know, projects we might not start until the 4th quarter, 3rd quarter, and so forth. So a lot coming and just trying to space it out as we can. And then I did have, and since it would come up, you've probably seen this before with some of Darren's updates. This is basically the conceptual layout of that North Side Cargo and Logistics Complex. Again, the taxiway delta at the bottom is really our portion. We talked about and coordinating with them. So more to come on that, but just as a frame of reference because we figured the question would come up. So that's it for this. Any questions on these projects before moving to the connector? Okay.
Ryan, if you could go back to the map of the Northside Airfield, the last screen.
Sure.
When I look at that, it doesn't look like we've got any room for additional pads. Do we have any additional capacity that we could build out over there that, assuming this continues to grow the way that it is, we would have the ability to expand and continue to do more freight?
We could, yes. Yeah, basically, John, to the east of where the existing ramp is, could be added. And that's something that we've looked at through the traffic studies and the design and talking with the developer as well. So it's, we do have the space for that, yes.
Okay, good. So this isn't it in terms of freight. We've got the ability, if we've got additional demand, this obviously will be 10, 15 years down the road, but we would have the capability to handle that if that were the case.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Oh, good question. Okay, moving to the connector. So this one, happy to say we're on the 1 yard line or half yard line, whatever you want to call it. We'll probably have an update next month. It'll probably be consolidated, and we'll get into some of the specifics a little bit later, but really a lot of progress in the last 2 months. Really just the finishing touches on the tunnel. Obviously the checkpoint's been open, really going through punch list, submittals, reviews, and so forth, but we'll kind of go through some of the photos. If you go down there now, you came in again from the parking lot, temporary partitions are down. We've kind of coordinated access, getting passengers through when we did some of the carpet. But as I mentioned, it's really, I think next week, the township's coming out to do their inspection, so there might be some punch list items from that. And again, really the closeout with the final documents, waiver of liens, certificates, and all those components from the contractors. So our secure exit portals or secure exit lanes that were put in, we've been testing those as well. So those are, again, allows folks to leave the secure area, doesn't allow them to come back. It's actually pretty neat. There's 3, some of you may have flown at other airports, there's 3 chambers, and they keep, as you're walking, you stop and try and turn around, the door will close, so you can't go back. Again, approved by TSA, coordination with them. See another photo, the carpet, flooring. Get another view of the tunnel, a lot brighter, more updated. And this is kind of a back hallway with the emergency exit, but between some of the storage areas. Excuse me. Again, the switch gear, some of the glass controls are there as well. Picture on the left is coming from the elevator. Again, with Darren and their group, got some advertising in there already. Coming down the escalators. Just right now with some of the construction, we got some temporary signage, but you kind of see that view. Sorry. See where we are in terms of percentage. Again, this phase really the final commissioning, and then we're good to go. So as I mentioned, in terms of the process, in terms of all the contractors' elements, their work is basically done in the next week. It's really just the township inspections, the TSA commissioning and approval, and then really beneficial occupancy of the tunnel in terms of just working through some of the punch list components. In terms of the grant receipts, it's gone up a little bit since last month. We have, speaking of RACB earlier, we have made some progress with them. Probably next month, we're actually going to submit the official reimbursement request. How much time it takes to actually get the money. Again, we could do the pool on that, but at least that is moving forward, which is helpful. And next month, as I mentioned, in terms of maybe the consolidated construction elements, we'll talk more about kind of the final project costs, where everything ended up, obviously with the grant receipts as well, for those discussions with, excuse me, with the committees. But that's really it. Happy to answer any questions.
Post and goal, ready for the brotherly shove.
That's right.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, we will move on to new business.
Thank you.
There is none. Madam Solicitor, do we have any need for an executive session on the business committee?
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll take a motion for adjournment.
Motion. Thank you, Glenn.
You're welcome. All right, we will move now to the executive committee. Sylvette, would you please call the roll for the executive committee?
John Hayes. Glenn
Here.
Glenn Reedman.
Present.
Justin Grimshaw.
Here.
Mike Stershik.
Here.
Paul Anthony. Good one.
Do we have any public comment?
No, sir.
Okay, I'll take a motion for approval of the meeting minutes for November 21st, 2023. Mike, second
Second.
by John. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Opposed? All right. The approval of the Florio Perucci Steinhardt invoices for November and December. We can both of those together. Okay. Have a motion for that?
Move.
Mike, and second by Justin. All in favor to approve the invoices? Say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay. Discussion item, update on the FAA policy regarding land use changes.
Okay, and for that one, I know we have Nick Clabbers on the line from Kaplan Kirsch Rockwell, our Specialty Aviation Council. So I think, I don't know if there's any need for us to jump into an exec session for anything here, Nick. So I think we're in public session, but if we do find the need, I'm sure we can do that.
Yes.
Okay, great. So Nick, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Tom. And I will see if I can share my screen here. Looks like somebody needs to stop sharing their screen so that I can share mine. I just have a few slides to run through on this. Perfect. There. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Looks like it. Okay, great. Well, thanks, Tom and Darren for having me in and for all the board. So I don't know if Darren distributed the material that I sent over to him. It was a bit late last night, but what Darren had asked me to do was summarize in particular, the FAA's new policy on land use changes, but also just briefly touch on two other policies that are coming down the pike, one of which is going to be effective in a couple weeks, and one that is proposed but not yet effective. So I want to just emphasize this is a very high-level overview. I'm really going to try to focus on what does this mean for the authority going forward. I'm not going to get into the legal nuances of any of this unless folks want to do that. I'm always happy to do that, but I recognize that we only have a limited amount of time and I don't want to bore all of you. So the three items that I want to touch on today are the new FAA policy on land use changes, the new FAA policy on air carrier incentive programs that'll be effective in a couple weeks. And then the final one is a proposed FAA redefinition of aeronautical activity. I'm going to run through these fairly fast with the intent that there's plenty of time for questions about these. So the first one is the FAA policy on land use changes. So the formal title of this policy is the Policy Regarding Processing Land Use Changes on Federally Acquired or Federally Conveyed Land, which is kind of a mouthful. This is effective at the beginning of January 8th. Importantly, it's not retroactive and it has no effect on existing leases or contracts. There's a bit of an exception to that we'll get to. Something to note, despite that really wordy title, it is imprecise and it does not only apply to federally acquired or federally conveyed land. Oops. So what does this policy say? So the objective, or FAA's stated objective here, is to provide a structure for the FAA to approve the use of some airport property for purposes other than an aeronautical or airport purpose. And I put those in quotes intentionally because those are defined terms under this policy. And the big takeaway is that now an airport sponsor like the authority has to seek FAA approval for each non-aeronautical or mixed use of airport property, and that those approvals expire with the underlying lease. So, for example, if you were to seek approval for a 25-year lease to build a warehouse on airport property, and that lease were to then expire, you would have to go back to the FAA for another approval at that point in time. Previously, there were, in some cases, the ability to permanently designate property as non-aeronautical. That is no more. The FAA has done away with that policy with this change, and so we no longer have the ability to do that. Importantly, this policy does not apply to two categories of land, noise land and what we call Section 163 land. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Section 163. We use that as shorthand to refer to Section 163 of the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act. So I'll do a very brief detour about that. In essence, the FAA for many, many years prior to 2018 took a very hard line about their regulation of airport property. They said anything that's happening on airport property anywhere is within our jurisdiction and we should have the power to regulate it. In 2018, Congress passed Section 163 as part of the FAA reauthorization law and really tried, and I emphasize tried, to eliminate FAA review over land use that is not primary to its mission. The idea was to give sponsors more flexibility and more autonomy to make land use decisions on property that was sort of outside the bounds of the aeronautical functions. So what the FAA says under Section 163 is that it retains jurisdiction only in these three circumstances: safe and efficient operation of aircraft or safety of people, and property on the ground related to aircraft operations, land or a facility acquired or modified using federal funding, and any authority contained in a Surplus Property Act deed. So we don't need to get into those, but the idea here is that anything that pertains to the core aeronautical functions of the airport or was acquired with federal funding generally is still subject to FAA regulation. So what are the types of land uses that we're talking about? And recall that these top two categories, aeronautical and airport purpose, are the ones that the FAA has determined generally are not subject to their approval, whereas the bottom two are now going to be subject to their approval. Aeronautical, pretty straightforward, though we'll see, when we get to the third policy that may be in flux. Those are the core aeronautical features of the airport: aircraft movement areas, development of aeronautical facilities, things like that. Airport purpose are things that are related to the aeronautical functions: terminals, FBOs, airport parking, service roads, truck parking for air cargo, so long as that's directly related to moving air cargo on and off the airport. Where we start to get into some of the difficult interpretive pieces of this policy are things that are mixed use. Cargo facilities where the primary purpose of the operation goes beyond air cargo processing and expands into non-aeronautical elements. Well, you tell me what that's supposed to mean. What is the primary purpose of the operation? So you can see with some of the things that are listed under each of these categories, they're not necessarily straightforward. And unfortunately, what that has done is introduced a pretty significant element of uncertainty here as to when some of these approvals will be required. The uncertainty can work in an airport sponsor's favor in some circumstances where we can maybe argue that something doesn't require approval, but it still throws a new feature into the regulatory process here. So I'm not going to go through every step of this flowchart, but this is something that we put together internally for our folks, trying to figure out what is the process here that the FAA has now set out. And it unfortunately used to be a little more straightforward. It generally just followed this very top line. We went to a Section 163 determination, and if the property was exempted from FAA jurisdiction, well, then we just move forward with the action. Now, unfortunately, we're in this, well, no, the 163 does not exempt the property from FAA jurisdiction. We're into the land use policy analysis. And we have to start figuring out whether there are non-aeronautical uses, mixed uses, et cetera, subject to FAA approval. When does the FAA decide that approval is acceptable, and when will they consent? Really what they're looking to balance is whether the request will have any effect on aeronautical facilities, or whether it will, for lack of a better word, hamstring future aeronautical development. So what we want to balance is this request reasonable when compared with the aeronautical demand and forecast aeronautical demand at the airport. That is the sort of core analysis that they're doing. So I've sort of touched on this, but there are a lot of open questions here with this new policy. The definitions of airport purpose and mixed use are entirely new. Those are not things that the FAA has used before in any context. They've used those words together, but never defined them. And I think because we're in the very early stages, it's going to be very difficult to determine when approval is required. And we may find ourselves in circumstances where the airport and the FAA have different views on whether approval is actually required. The policy really does not set out anything beyond these four standards for when an approval, is acceptable. It leaves that discretion to local FAA airport district offices, and there's no national standards or a rubric or anything of that nature. So we are very likely to end up in a scenario where FAA officials in Texas and Idaho and Pennsylvania all come up with different results for similar projects. It puts us in a difficult position because we may not necessarily be comparing apples to apples. The FAA specifically avoided the question of whether this new process will trigger federal environmental review. For any of you that have been through an environmental review process under the National Environmental Policy Act, know that that can be onerous, and sometimes it is very quick. It can be, you know, a few months if it's some of the lesser levels of environmental review, but it can also considerably lengthen the process. And this is in previous projects where the FAA was involved, you know, NEPA may not have applied, but we really just don't know right now whether that's going to be the case with this approval. Also, the time frame for the FAA's review, the FAA, again, specifically avoided this question. Some of the comments to this policy were asking about, you know, can the FAA estimate how long it's going to take to get these types of approvals? And the response was that each situation is unique and the time frame is dependent upon airport-specific information. So that is a non-answer if I've ever heard one. So we really don't know what that's going to look like yet. So what does this mean for the authority? You know, I think fundamentally there's going to be a more onerous regulatory process for some non-aeronautical and mixed-use projects. And the one that, you know, we've discussed a little bit with Darren is the hotel project that's sort of on the horizon. And, you know, we haven't looked at that in depth yet, but that's the one that jumped out to us as this policy has the greatest likelihood to apply and potentially, you know, cause some consternation with. Because the policy explicitly now removes the ability to permanently designate property as non-aeronautical, again, this is a use-based approval, it really limits the ability to market some property as available for immediate non-aeronautical development. And I want to caveat that by saying that property can certainly be marketed that way, but it has to be with the understanding that there will be a regulatory process on top of that, and that it is not, you know, build ready necessarily from a regulatory approval standpoint. The recurring agricultural leases that you have, you know, around the airport and on various pieces of airport property, you know, previously those were just rolling 1 year or 2 year agreements, and the FAA really was not interested in looking at those. Well, technically, under the language of this new policy, the FAA makes it sound like those are the types of leases that they're interested in reviewing and approving each time they roll over. I'm not sure if they understand the full impact of that, and you know, it may be a conversation to have with the local office about whether that's something they really want to be doing because the use is continuing. But it is going to be another potential administrative hoop to jump through. The one saving grace here is that just from working with Darren and Matt on a lot of this property, the authority has a fair amount of property that is likely outside the scope of this new policy, meaning you know, property that is outside the FAA's jurisdiction under Section 163, or is noise land that is governed by an entirely separate process. So, you know, each transaction will have to take a look at exactly what the history of that property is and whether this policy causes an additional piece of analysis to pass through the FAA. But I think just from my knowledge of the airport's real estate, I think there's a decent amount of property that just won't fall under this policy. So some strategy considerations here, just being aware of the timing and understanding that you know, this could lengthen the process for some development projects. Coordinating any approvals with the Section 163 determination, Darren and Matt and their teams are good about running through the Section 163, and to the extent that any necessary approvals can be consolidated with that, I think it helps to streamline the process. Of course, the objective would be to seek the broadest and longest approval possible, in as many circumstances as we can, so that we're not going back to the FAA unnecessarily. Drafting the leases in a way that minimizes resubmission and dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's with that. And then because of the way the policy is written to give the local offices so much discretion, continuing coordination with the FAA at the local level is going to be vitally important on this. We're in week 3 of this policy, and I have gathered that local FAA offices are not always are still not sure what to do with this quite yet either, and so it's going to be a process for everyone involved. So before I move on to the next policy, does anybody have any questions about this?
I have like a comment.
Sure.
Slash question. I think like as an authority, the revenue that can be generated from non-aeronautical leases will become more and more important, especially because in previous slides we saw how the carriers are affected by the market and how it's constantly fluctuating. So leases like the hotel, or if you want to put up a cell phone tower somewhere that's anything non-related to aeronautical use, I think we need to try to protect the authority's right to be able to do that a little more freely. My experience is when there's more regulation, there's a lot more cost, there's a lot more time. And part of like a strategy consideration we should maybe think about is some sort of development corporation that can operate in a way where you can bypass some of this regulation, because it's the development corporation that's operating with certain interests aligned with the airport authority. So for instance, if a development corporation owns the land, you might not be subject to some of these regulations. Or the development corporation could hold an extremely long-term lease and sublet to a hotel operator. Things like that to try to minimize issues where, when there's turnover administratively or at the board level and people lose familiarity with leases, you can kind of hedge yourselves long-term from having some of these issues arise in the future. So something like a development corporation, you see it done at housing authority levels where, their housing authorities are subject to certain things like wage labor rates or whatever that might, hurt a project. What they do is they use a development corporation to be able to add value in ways that the authority, can't otherwise because of regulation. So it's something to think about from a strategy standpoint. Long term is, if we don't have one, is it something that we should think about putting in place and having common controls with the authority?
Yeah,
So I don't know if we want to start getting into a lot of discussion in open session on that. I don't know, in terms of an overall strategy or approach there. I'm not sure what your thoughts are.
I think we're okay
Framework
to
on it.
we should be open
Okay.
at this stage, yeah.
So Nick, I don't know if you want to try to respond there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, from a business standpoint, I agree with you. That makes a lot of sense. The issue that we tend to run into with trying to do something like that is that for the authority to sell property or transfer property to any economic development authority or any party at all like that runs into essentially the same FAA regulatory approval process as leasing it directly. So for example, if the authority wanted to sell a piece of property to an economic development authority for $1 as a means to sort of get around this FAA approval process, the FAA more than likely will not allow that transaction to happen because there are specific rules around how the property can be alienated from the airport. And the only way that we get out from under the FAA regulatory process is to alienate the property from the airport. So regardless of how you set it up, we get sucked into the FAA regulatory sphere no matter what.
Yeah. So again, like aside from transferring land, a development corporation could hold the lease and sublet to, the developer or the hotel operator or whatever, and you can have longer term leases with that development corporation that are somewhat meaningless other than you don't have a termination to that lease, and then you can have flexibility with the sublet. So it's just something to think about where it might become beneficial depending upon how restrictive these regulations get.
Yeah, I don't want to frame it as impossible by any means, but I think even doing a long-term lease would have to have some FAA considerations around it.
Oh, good question. On the termination of the use after the end of the lease, where it goes back to, if it's approved and the lease is 25 years and 25 years have passed and you now, that lease terminates, what happens to what is built on that property if the FAA does not allow the use to continue? So let's say you have a hotel, as an example, with a 25-year lease, and the FAA says, no, you can't continue that. What happens to this 300-room hotel that you have on the property?
That is a very good question. So the answer, the best answer that I can give you right now is that the FAA always expects in any long-term lease to have sponsors to have a provision that says upon the termination of this lease, the improvements will become property of the airport. So if you have a 25-year lease for the hotel, the developer builds the hotel is now owned by the authority after that lease expires. But you're absolutely right. If the approval has now expired to use that property for a hotel, I don't know the answer to that. I have a feeling that when the FAA is forced to confront exactly that issue, the likelihood that they will not reissue a new approval is very low. It just won't make any sense at that point. But I also think that sort of speaks to why they feel this policy is important. They don't want to be in the position where they're granting extremely long approvals for things. They want to be able to reassess whether there's aeronautical need at different points in time. Whether that's the right approach or not, that's not for me to decide, but that is, I think, part of the rationale behind this policy.
That's part of the issue is the airport ends up owning the liability. And so if they're like, hey, you can't do this, tear it down, right? That's why we have to put measures in place to protect the authority from those costs. And look, they might say today, hey, we're not going to make you do that, but I don't know if we want to put our trust there.
Yeah, understood. And we always recommend that provision that allows the authority to own the improvements at the end of the lease be paired with a provision that says if the authority doesn't want to own the improvements, the tenant has to tear them down.
Yep.
And return the property to its original condition. So. All right. So if there are no other questions on that, I can move through the other two here relatively quickly. So the next policy that I want to touch on is the FAA's policy on air carrier incentive programs. So this governs the scope of permissible incentives offered by airport sponsors to attract, quote, new service. And that has a very specific definition that I won't totally get into. So the prior FAA guidance on this issue has been in effect since 2010. And the new policy doesn't change the existing guidance very much. The principles are very similar. The new policy is effective February 5th, but existing incentive agreements may continue past that date until they expire. So I know that you all have a few incentive agreements with carriers. Those are not affected by this policy. However, when those agreements expire, they will have to adhere to this new policy. Quick highlights of the policy change. Overall, it increases the flexibility that sponsors have to offer incentives. It now allows for specifically allows for incentives for significant increases in service on an existing route, including upgauging. Previously, under the old policy, upgauging was really not a favored aspect of incentives, and it now is explicitly permitted to be part of a sponsor's incentive program. Sponsors can now offer incentives for seasonal service over a longer overall period of 3 years. Typically, most incentives are limited to only a 2-year period, but seasonal service now has a 3-year period. Sponsors can limit incentives to the first carrier to establish certain service. In prior years, essentially the obligation existed to give the incentive to any carrier that was providing the requested service, but now for certain routes and under certain circumstances, that can be limited. Importantly, the old policy was very strict about whether an airport sponsor and its staff could provide any assistance to an outside entity in establishing or administering a separate incentive program. So we see this often with local chambers of commerce or other business organizations that want to provide things like a minimum revenue guarantee to an airline to provide service. Before, because of the way that the FAA regulates airport revenues and some of the non-discrimination grant assurances, airport staff could not assist with those programs. They had to be, there had to essentially be a firewall so that there was no chance that there was any mixing of revenues or a possibility of favoring one carrier over the other. Now the policy allows airport staff to provide limited technical assistance to those other entities. And the FAA doesn't exactly define what limited technical assistance means in those circumstances, but really it's things like advising on what the market can bear, what type of service might be best incentivized. Are we looking for low-cost service? Are we looking for specific service to Florida? Do the airport's aeronautical facilities best suited to a certain type of service? Those types of things. So I think it really provides another aspect to an airport sponsor to work with local organizations for some of these things. And finally, it allows reimbursing of marketing expenses directly to an airline, which just is a streamlining of some of the process here. Couple of drawbacks to the new policy. Sponsors cannot offer incentives that waive ground handling or fuel flowage fees. For a lot of airports, that's not a big deal. For you all, it's not part of your existing policy, but I did want to highlight it because the authority provides ground handling and fuel flowage services, through its own corporation. That is not an incentive that can be offered under this new policy. It also requires sponsors to develop a standalone program document and not attach it to a specific airline agreement. That's no different than what you already have. Finally, the big one that some sponsors were upset about, there is now an expectation, not a requirement, to provide notice to affected airlines at least 30 days in advance of executing any agreement. It's really intended to kind of prevent backroom incentive agreements with all carriers being aware of the incentives being available. So what does this mean for you? Good news, the existing program was already compliant with the new policy. There really wasn't any changes that needed to be made. The better news is that the new policy, as I just talked about, enables additional flexibility. So I don't know where you are in the approval process of this, but the changes that I worked with Darren on, we updated some of the target destinations to incentivize service to specific other airports. We added incentives for seasonal service and added incentives for upgauging. So really, it expands the universe of service that is now eligible for incentives under the program. So, any questions about that before we move on? Great. All right, the very last one that I'll blow through very quickly is the proposed redefinition of aeronautical activity. So the FAA has proposed to refine the definition of aeronautical activity, essentially to broaden it to include most UAS, but not recreational use, advanced air mobility, and commercial space vehicle operations. So it's a little technical, but we do care about this. Sponsors are required to accommodate aeronautical activities and must treat aeronautical users reasonably and without unjust discrimination. So this redefinition potentially expands the scope of these obligations, but the piece that we are looking at and sort of scratching our head over is that not all of the activities proposed under this new redefinition actually require airfield or airport access. You know, advanced air mobility can take off from a small piece of land that's not connected to the airport. Same with UAS, and commercial space operations are an entirely you know, new animal as well. So we don't really know where this is going. This is a proposal. The comment period closed just 10 days ago. There's no timeline for the final policy. If it is finalized as proposed, it's not really clear what immediate impact it's going to have. But with all of these new entrant technologies, our sort of call it a warning to our clients is that they are coming quickly. The AAM's area in particular is expected to have aircraft certificated not too long from now. So it would not be surprising to see requests for accommodation of these users at the airports going forward, particularly if this definition is finalized. So, any questions on any of that material? Again, I know that was a high level overview of those three things, and maybe was a little more than you were expecting on just the land use policy, but I did want to run through those just to give you an overview of what's going on in the FAA world.
Nick, I had a question. Do you have any idea what the catalyst was for these policy changes, or is this something that's just done periodically, or?
So the land use change policy, that I think has been in the works for quite a while, since the advent of Section 163 in 2018. That really threw the FAA for a loop, and they, I think, realized that they needed some sort of structure to work through the approval process for land use changes and non-aeronautical development and all of the things that airports are doing across the country in that area. I think the air carrier incentive program was just sort of a refresh of the same principles. And the aeronautical activity definition is really born out of, I think, the need to incorporate UAS and advanced air mobility into the national air system. The FAA folks are working overtime on all aspects of that, from an airspace perspective, a land use perspective. They see the writing on the wall that these, to the extent they're not already here, they're coming, and they're trying their hardest to get the regulatory structure in place before it's too late. I think there's also some senior FAA leadership that's retiring very soon, and there's a push to get some of this stuff done before they're out the door, frankly.
Any other questions for Nick? Seeing none, thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you.
All right, thanks all.
We'll move on to new business. If there any new business for the executive committee? Madam Solicitor, any need for an executive session? Seeing none, we'll take a motion for adjournment. So moved. And we'll see everybody. We'll see everybody on Tuesday, the 30th at high noon.